The world was, for Lily, a symphony. David had learned to appreciate it through her, to filter the mundane cacophony of a suburban morning into its distinct, delicate parts. He could hear the sizzle of bacon in the pan, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant groan of a garbage truck down the street. But Lily could hear the signature of the brand of bacon, the specific oscillation in the fridge's motor that meant the compressor was about to kick off, and the slight, rhythmic squeak in the garbage truck's axle that identified it as Old Man Hemlock's route. "The toast is almost ready. Daddy," she said, her small voice a clear note in the kitchen's chorus. She sat at the small wooden table, her sightless eyes aimed in the direction of the toaster, a faint smile on her lips. At 7, she navigated her world not with a cane, but with an acoustic map of breathtaking precision. "I know, sweet pea. I'm watching it," David replied, flipping the bacon. "No, you're not. You're looking at the bacon. The heating element in the toaster just did its little click before it pops." He chuckled, turning just in time to see the toast leap from its slots. "Show off." He placed the plate in front of her, bacon at 3 o'clock, toast at 9, eggs at 6, a system they'd perfected long ago. Her small fingers immediately found the edges of the toast. Outside, the symphony played on. A blue jay screeched a territorial warning from the oak tree. The mail truck sighed to a stop across the street, its door sliding open with a familiar metallic scrape. Lily's head tilted. "Mrs. Gable is getting another package from that fancy shoe website." "I can hear the cardboard box creak." David looked through the window, and sure enough, the mail carrier was walking a brown box up to the Gables' front porch. He shook his head in fond disbelief. He was her eyes, describing the color of the sunset or the shape of a funny-looking cloud. But she was his ears, revealing a hidden, vibrant layer of existence that he, with his perfectly good hearing, had been deaf to his entire life. She was the conductor, and he was her most devoted audience. That was why, when the symphony stopped, the silence was more profound than a mere absence of noise. It wasn't a fading. It wasn't a dampening. It was a severance. One moment, the bacon was sizzling. A car was honking 2 blocks over. Lily was humming a little tune. The refrigerator was humming its low, steady mantra. The next, there was nothing. A universal, instantaneous cut. The sizzle didn't fade. It was just gone. The hum didn't wind down. It vanished mid-vibration. The sound of David's own breathing, the frantic beat of his heart in his chest, all of it silenced. He stood frozen over the stove, a spatula in his hand. Confusion was the first wave. He tapped his ears, a primitive, instinctual gesture. Nothing. It felt like his head was wrapped in 100 layers of thick cotton. Pressure, a fullness, but no sound. He swallowed, but the familiar little click and slide in his throat didn't happen. He looked at the bacon. It was still cooking, tiny beads of grease dancing on its surface, but its signature hiss was gone. He looked at the coffee maker, which had been mid-gurgle. The brown liquid was still dripping into the pot, a silent, sterile process. Then the second wave hit. Fear. A cold, sharp dread that started in his gut and radiated outwards. He spun around to look at Lily. She was the picture of absolute terror. Her world, the intricate and beautiful orchestra she lived inside, had been obliterated. Her hands were clamped over her ears, a gesture she'd never used before. Her chair was pushed back from the table, her body rigid. Her mouth was open in a scream that David could see but not hear. A raw, desperate, silent O of horror that was more terrifying than any sound could ever be. For a person who could hear, the silence was unnerving. For Lily, it was the end of the world. David rushed to her side, his own panic taking a back seat to the primal need to comfort his child. He knelt, pulling her small, trembling hands away from her head. Her face was pale, streaked with silent tears. He spoke her name, but the word was a ghost in his throat. No vibration, no sound. He was mouthing platitudes he couldn't hear, his voice stolen from him. "It's okay, Lily, it's okay. I'm here." The words felt like sand in his mouth, meaningless without their music. He pulled her into a hug, her small body shaking violently against his. He looked past her, out the kitchen window, searching for an answer, for any clue. What he saw only deepened the nightmare. Outside, everything looked normal, but felt profoundly wrong. A car had swerved onto a lawn. its driver standing beside it, hands to his head, just like Lily. People were wandering out of their houses, their faces masks of confusion and panic. A man was shouting at his neighbor, his face red, veins bulging in his neck. But it was all a silent pantomime. The world had been put on mute. David's gaze was drawn back to the blue jay in the oak tree. It was perched on a branch, its beak opening and closing in its familiar, screeching rhythm. But no sound came out. The bird was screaming into a void. He held Lily tighter, his heart, whose frantic beating he could now only feel, not hear, aching for her. He was her protector, the one who was supposed to make sense of the world for her. But as he looked at his daughter's terrified face, he knew he was utterly powerless. The world had gone silent, and in doing so, it had stolen his daughter's reality, leaving them both alone in a terrifying, unfeeling vacuum. He rocked her gently, his mind racing for an explanation. A solar flare, a bizarre atmospheric event, a mass hallucination. But no rational thought could explain the sheer, impossible totality of it. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that had been thrown over the world, smothering the symphony forever. The first 24 hours were a lesson in suffocation. The silence wasn't a void. It was a physical weight. It pressed in on the eardrums, creating a phantom pressure that David felt deep inside his skull. Every action was unnervingly sterile. A glass placed on the counter made no clink. A door swinging shut offered no satisfying thump. He found himself moving with exaggerated care, as if a loud movement might still somehow break the spell. But his heaviest footfalls were as silent as a falling feather. Communication became a clumsy ballet of gestures and frantic scribbling on a notepad he found in a kitchen drawer. The first words he wrote to Lily, after carrying her to the couch and wrapping her in her favorite blanket, were simple. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She had curled into a tight fetal position, her face buried in the cushions. Her small body was a knot of grief. For her, this was more than a loss of hearing. It was a loss of identity, a loss of the very fabric of her reality. David's heart fractured seeing her so utterly lost. He was her anchor, but the sea she sailed on had just evaporated. He tried to create a sense of normalcy, a fool's errand. He turned on the television. The screen flickered to life, displaying a frantic-looking news anchor, mouth opening and closing with desperate urgency. A chyron at the bottom of the screen, a stark, block-lettered testament to the global scale of the event. All channels, all frequencies, global phenomenon. The lack of sound made the images surreal, like watching a disaster movie with the volume on mute. It was clinical, detached, and utterly terrifying. He spent the day trying to coax Lily out of her shell. He brought her food, which she ignored. He described the world outside, the eerie stillness that had replaced the initial panic, the small groups of neighbors clustered on lawns, communicating with shared notepads and wide, frightened eyes. He read to her from one of her Braille books, his fingers tracing the familiar bumps, his voice a silent movement of his lips. She remained unresponsive, lost in the wreckage of her sensory world. The sun began to set, painting the silent houses in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it felt like a cruel joke. As darkness fell, a new quality of fear emerged. The familiar house, once a source of comfort, became a tomb. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more menacing without the gentle hum of electricity, or the settling groans of a house at night to soften the edges. The power grid miraculously was still holding, but the light it provided felt artificial, a spotlight on a silent, terrifying stage. David eventually carried Lily to her bed. He sat in the small rocking chair beside her, watching the slow, even rise and fall of her chest in the dim light of her dinosaur-shaped nightlight. For hours, the only sign of her consciousness was the silent tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes, tracing paths down her temples and into her hair. David's own fear was a constant cold companion, but seeing her silent, profound sorrow was an agony beyond anything he had ever known. He felt a desperate, primal urge to fix it, to scream at the sky and demand the world back for his daughter. But a scream was a currency he no longer possessed. It was close to midnight when it happened. The silent crying, which had been her only form of expression for nearly a day, stopped. The change was so sudden it was jarring. One moment, her body was trembling with grief. The next, it was perfectly still. David leaned forward, his own breath catching in his chest, a feeling, not a sound. In the dim green glow of the plastic stegosaurus, he saw her eyes were open, but they weren't staring blankly at the ceiling anymore. Her head was tilted just slightly in that old familiar way. The way she used to listen for the faint chirp of a cricket under the floorboards, or the sound of rain 5 miles away. She was listening. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He slowly reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, afraid to break the spell. Before he could touch her, she turned her head to face him, her expression unreadable. She sat up, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out, her small hand finding his, and her touch was cold. She brought his hand to her throat, a gesture she made when she wanted him to feel her talk. She took a breath, and he felt the faint, ghost-like vibration of her vocal cords. "Daddy." The single word, felt more than heard, was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees washed over him. She was back, but then she spoke again, her voice a tiny tremor against his fingertips. "It's not quiet anymore." David stared at her, his relief instantly evaporating, replaced by a chilling confusion. He shook his head, placing a finger on his own lips and then pointing to his ears. He scribbled on the notepad he'd brought with him, the scratching of the pen an obscene violation of the stillness. "What do you mean?" "Nothing has changed." Lily shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. She looked past him, towards the darkest corner of the room, as if focusing on a specific point of origin. She took his hand again, pressing it to her throat. "There are whispers," she vibrated. "They were so quiet at first, but they're getting louder." A cold dread trickled down David's spine. Auditory hallucination, tinnitus, that had to be it. Her brain, deprived of all input, was creating its own phantoms to fill the void. It was a common phenomenon, he reasoned, trying to cling to logic in a world that had abandoned it. A psychological echo. He forced a comforting smile, stroking her hair. He wrote on the pad again, his letters large and reassuring. "It's okay, sweet pea. Your ears are just playing tricks on you. It's so quiet. Your brain is making up noises. It will pass." He expected her to be comforted by the explanation. Instead, for the first time since the silence began, a clear, sharp emotion crossed her face. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to annoyance, to certainty. She shook her head again, more firmly this time. Her grip on his hand tightened. "No," she vibrated, her small throat working. "They're not tricks. They're real." She paused, her head tilting again, her sightless eyes seeming to look right through him. "And they're happy. They're happy it's quiet now." A week bled into another. A strange silent routine began to calcify. They ate their meals in the heavy quiet, the scrape of a fork on a plate a phantom sensation. They read, David's eyes scanning pages, Lily's fingers dancing over braille. At night, David would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind a frantic hive of unanswered questions. What was it? Where did it come from? Was the whole world gone or just their small corner of it? He tried to stay rational, to treat the situation as a long-term survival scenario. He took meticulous inventory of their food. He filled the bathtubs with water in case the utilities failed. He did all of this with a gnawing sense of dread, not just from the oppressive silence, but from his daughter. Lily was no longer the grief-stricken child from the first day. She had adapted with an unnerving speed. She was now a sentinel, perpetually tuned to a frequency he couldn't perceive. She would stop in the middle of a room, her head tilted, her expression distant. She had taken to carrying the notepad and a pen with her everywhere, scribbling messages to him with a focused intensity. Her notes were becoming more specific and infinitely more disturbing. "They are always here," she wrote one afternoon, as David was methodically checking the locks on the windows. "But they aren't always listening." David had continued to operate under the assumption that this was a complex trauma response. He'd read about sensory deprivation leading to powerful hallucinations. He tried to be gentle, to be understanding. "Who are they, sweet pea?" He wrote back, treating it like a fantasy game he needed to play along with for her sake. She took the pen, her small fingers gripping it tightly. She didn't write. She began to draw. A series of swirling, chaotic lines like a cloud of insects or a tangle of thread. There was no form, no body, just a sense of disjointed, agitated presence. Beneath the drawing, she wrote a single, chilling name: the listeners. He tried to get her to describe what she was hearing. His clinical mind, starved for data, thought that if he could understand the hallucination, he could help her move past it. Her descriptions, however, offered no comfort. They were poetic and terrifying. "They don't sound like voices," she wrote, her pen scratching silently on the paper. "They sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement, like 1,000 moths beating their wings against a window pane at night. Sometimes they sound like sand falling in a very old hourglass." The description sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cool air in the house. They were too specific, too alien to be born from the mind of a 7-year-old. Still, he clung to reason. It was her brain translating the trauma into a language she could understand. It had to be. The turning point, the moment his carefully constructed wall of denial began to crumble, came on a Tuesday. David was looking out the living room window, watching his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man in his late 60s. Henderson was pacing frantically in his front yard, his face a mask of raw panic. He was gesturing wildly at the sky, his mouth forming silent screams of rage and despair. He looked like a man at the absolute end of his rope. As David watched, Lily came up beside him, placing her small hand on his arm. She was trembling. "What is it?" David mouthed, his heart quickening at her distress. She didn't write. She pulled him away from the window, her grip insistent. When they were in the center of the room, she began scribbling furiously on her pad. "He's being too loud." David frowned, writing back. "What do you mean? It's silent. There's no sound." "Not with his voice," she wrote, underlining the words twice. "With his head, all his fear, all his anger. It's like a shout the listeners. They like it. It draws them in." David looked back at the window. Mr. Henderson was now on his knees, clutching his head, his body rocking back and forth. A silent, primal scream of anguish. Lily pressed herself against David's leg, her face hidden. Her own notepad was clutched in her hand. "He's making the whispers so loud, they're swarming." It's a roar of skittering leaves and dying moths. David felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell her it was just her imagination. But he was frozen in place, watching the grim tableau unfold in the yard next door. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, yet a primal instinct screamed at him that something was terribly wrong. He stayed at the window for another hour. Eventually, Mr. Henderson stopped moving. He simply lay on his lawn, unnervingly still. No one came out to check on him. No one did anything. In a world without sound, a man could die in plain sight and it would be as quiet and unremarkable as a stone settling into the earth. That night, David couldn't sleep. The implication of what Lily had said was monstrous. If she was right, then the danger wasn't outside. It was inside his own skull. Every fearful thought, every desperate plan he formulated was a potential beacon. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the notepad in front of him, trying to map out a strategy. They needed more non-perishable food. The water might not last forever. What if the power grid failed? What was the long-term plan? His mind was racing, a chaotic storm of logistics and fear. Suddenly, a small hand touched his shoulder. He jumped, startled. It was Lily, standing behind him in her pajamas, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the window. She was holding her own notepad. She held it out for him to read. One simple, terrifying sentence. "You need to be quiet, Daddy." He looked at her, confused. He hadn't made a move, hadn't uttered a sound. He wrote back, "I am being quiet." She shook her head, her expression more serious than he had ever seen it. She took his pen and wrote directly underneath his words, her letters sharp and urgent. "No, your thoughts are shouting." David stared at the words on the notepad. "Your thoughts are shouting." The accusation was so impossible, so insane that his first instinct was to reject it. But the image of Mr. Henderson, still and silent on the lawn next door, was seared into his mind. He looked at Lily, at the absolute unwavering certainty in her eyes, and a terrifying thought took root. What if she was right? The next few days were an exercise in self-inflicted madness. David tried to silence his own mind. He discovered it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. The moment he tried to stop thinking, his brain would rebel, flooding him with a torrent of fears, plans, memories, and questions. He tried to focus on simple things: the feeling of the dishcloth in his hands, the pattern of the wood grain on the table, the rhythm of his own silent breathing. It was a constant, exhausting battle against his own consciousness. During this time, Lily became his warden. She would watch him, her head tilted, and gently touch his arm if his thoughts began to stray. "Too sharp, Daddy," she would write. "You're thinking about the water again. Think about something soft. Think about clouds." He was a student in a school he couldn't comprehend, learning a lesson of survival from his 7-year-old daughter. The proof that this was not a shared delusion came from Marcus. Marcus lived in the house on the other side of theirs. He was a retired sound engineer, a known eccentric who David had only ever exchanged pleasantries with. On the 5th day after his revelation from Lily, David saw Marcus emerge from his house looking wiry and sleep-deprived. He was carrying a large whiteboard and a marker. He caught David's eye through the window and gestured frantically for him to come outside. Hesitantly, David stepped out onto his front porch. The oppressive silence of the world seemed to press in even harder outdoors. Marcus, standing on his own lawn about 30 feet away, began to write. His handwriting was a jagged, frantic scrawl. "It's a frequency," the board read. "Not a loss of sound. It's an infrasonic blanket. A standing wave canceling everything else out. Have you studied acoustics?" David shook his head, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief. Here was another adult, a man of science, offering a theory. It was something tangible, something that wasn't whispers. Marcus wiped the board clean with his sleeve and wrote again. "We can beat it. Shielding, a Faraday cage might disrupt it. Or we could generate a counter-frequency. White noise on a massive scale. We need to work together. I have equipment in my basement." A small hand tugged on David's shirt. Lily had followed him outside. She couldn't see the whiteboard, of course, but she didn't need to. Her face was tight with anxiety. She shoved her notepad into his hand. "We have to go inside, now." David felt torn. Marcus's words, his desperate hope for a scientific solution, were a siren song. Plan, action. It was everything his mind craved. He looked at Marcus, who was now excitedly drawing a complex diagram of what looked like an antenna array. "Why?" David mouthed to Lily. She took the notepad and wrote, her hand trembling. "He's thinking too loud. It's not just fear, it's ideas, maps. They hate it. It's worse than a scream. He's drawing them a picture of his mind." The phrase sent an ice-cold dread through David's veins, eclipsing the spark of hope Marcus had ignited. A picture of his mind. On the whiteboard, Marcus wrote, "What do you say?" "We can build a transmitter. We can fight back." He looked at David, his eyes wide with a manic, hopeful light. "Please, Daddy," Lily's note read. "He's ringing a dinner bell." David looked from his daughter's terrified face to his neighbor's hopeful one. He had to choose. The world of science and reason, or the impossible, terrifying world his daughter described. The image of Mr. Henderson, still and silent on the grass, made the choice for him. He gave Marcus a slow, regretful shake of his head, took Lily's hand, and retreated back inside the house, locking the door behind them. He could feel Marcus's bewildered, disappointed stare on his back. He led Lily to the living room, away from the front windows. He felt like a coward, but his daughter's fear was a more powerful motivator than a stranger's hope. They sat on the floor, and on Lily's instruction, David spent the next several minutes trying to empty his mind, focusing only on the pattern of the carpet beneath his fingers. After a while, a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress made him crawl to the edge of the front window and peek through the blinds. Marcus was still in his yard. But he wasn't writing anymore. The whiteboard lay on the grass at his feet, covered in schematics. He was standing perfectly still, his back to David's house. He seemed to be looking at the sky. Then, as David watched, Marcus's hands rose slowly to his temples. His posture, which had been so full of frantic energy, went rigid. His head tilted back, his mouth opening in a silent, agonized gasp. He looked less like a man in pain, and more like a puppet whose strings had been pulled taut. He stood that way for a long, terrible moment before collapsing, as boneless as a scarecrow. Onto the manicured lawn, the whiteboard with its frantic, hopeful plans lay beside him. David slid down to the floor, his back against the wall, his heart a silent, frantic drum against his ribs. It wasn't panic. It wasn't a random aneurysm. It was the planning, the schematics, the hope. Marcus hadn't died from fear. He had been executed for thinking. Lily was right. The whispers were real. The listeners were real. And the rules were real. He crawled over to his daughter and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair. She was no longer his poor, sick daughter suffering from delusions. She was a prophet. She was a survivor. She was the only thing in this dead, silent world that made any sense. The bodies of his neighbors became David's silent teachers. From his window, he could see Henderson's shape on the lawn to his left and Marcus's to his right. They were grim, silent statues marking the boundaries of the new world and its unforgiving laws. The law of panic and the law of planning. Both carried the same sentence. Death by thought. David was now a believer. His skepticism had been purged in the crucible of Marcus's silent, horrifying death. He looked at Lily now not just with love but with a profound, terrifying reverence. She was the sole cartographer of this new invisible landscape of horrors. His survival, and hers, depended entirely on his ability to read her maps. Their home transformed from a shelter into a monastery, a dojo for the art of mental silence. And Lily was its sensei. The first lesson was in the art of the mundane. You have to give your thoughts a simple job to do, she explained. Her meaning conveyed through a mix of scribbled notes and the familiar vibrations against his hand. If you don't, they will do a dangerous job on their own. So David worked. He scrubbed floors that were already clean. He washed and re-washed the same set of dishes, focusing on the slick glide of the soap, the texture of the sponge, the circular motion of his hand. He dusted furniture that had no dust. The repetitive physical tasks became a mantra, a way to occupy the loud frontal part of his brain, so the deeper, more fearful parts couldn't start screaming. At first, it was torture. His mind, accustomed to a lifetime of multitasking and constant analysis, fought him at every turn. While scrubbing a counter, a thought would spike. How much food do we have left? The question was sharp, complex. It had tendrils of fear attached to it. He would immediately feel a tug on his sleeve. Lily would be there, her face etched with concern. "Too sharp, Daddy," her note would read. "The edges are showing. Stop thinking about the food. Think about the circle your hand is making. Just the circle. Round and smooth." He would force his mind back to the simple task, his heart hammering a silent, frantic rhythm. He was terrified of his own mind. It had become a wild, untamed animal, and any lapse in concentration could get them both killed. The second lesson was sensory anchoring. Lily would place a smooth, cool stone from her collection into his palm. "When the thoughts get loud, hold this," she instructed. "Don't think about the stone. Just feel it. Feel how heavy it is. Feel how smooth it is. Give all the room in your head to that feeling." He began to carry the stone in his pocket everywhere. It was his anchor in the storm of his own consciousness. Whenever a rogue wave of fear or planning threatened to crest, he would grip the stone. Its simple, tangible reality, a lifeline. He would spend what felt like hours just tracing its surface with his thumb, pouring his mental energy into that single, silent sensation until the dangerous thoughts receded. The most difficult lesson was in cultivating soft thoughts. One afternoon, a wave of grief ambushed him. He was folding a load of laundry when he picked up one of his late wife's old t-shirts. The faint, phantom scent of her perfume, a scent he hadn't noticed in years, sent a jolt through his system. A memory of her laughing in the garden flashed through his mind, and with it, a piercing, razor-sharp agony of loss. Where is she? Is she dead like them? Will I ever— Stop! The vibration of Lily's voice against the floorboards was so sharp, he felt it in his teeth. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her hands pressed to her temples, her face contorted in pain. He had hurt her. His thoughts had physically hurt her. He dropped the shirt as if it were burning. Lily rushed to him, grabbing the notepad. That was too loud. Too sharp, she scrawled, her letters jagged with distress. The memory is okay, but the questions are not. The sadness is not. They are made of knives. She took his hand, her small fingers cool on his. When you think of Mommy, she wrote, her letters softening. Don't think about where she is. Think about the color of her eyes. Think about the sound her laugh used to have. The memories are round. The questions are sharp. You have to learn the difference. He nodded, a silent tear tracing a path down his cheek. He looked at the t-shirt on the floor, and this time, he forced himself to remember the day she bought it, the silly argument they had about the cartoon character on the front. He remembered the specific shade of blue of her eyes when she laughed. He held on to that image, that soft, round memory, until the sharp edges of his grief had dulled into a bearable, quiet ache. Lily watched him, and the pained expression on her face slowly relaxed. He was learning. The days began to blend into a quiet rhythm of chores, sensory anchors, and carefully curated thoughts. He was becoming a monk of the mind. He could go for an hour, sometimes two, in a state of near thoughtlessness, his mind as placid as a still pond. There was a strange, hollow peace in the emptiness, but as he looked out the window one evening at the two silent forms decaying on his neighbors' lawns, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't living. It was a holding pattern, a state of suspended animation. They had built a sanctuary of silence in their house, but it was also a prison. They couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, the food would run out. The water would stop. A prison, no matter how safe, is still a prison. And that, he realized, was a plan. A sharp, dangerous, and absolutely necessary thought. He looked over at Lily, who was tracing the braille in a book, a small, peaceful smile on her face. He had to get her somewhere truly safe. And for the first time, the fear of thinking was overcome by the fear of staying put. The thought had been born of necessity, and it was the most dangerous thing David had ever created. We have to leave. It was a thought so sharp, so full of jagged edges and branching possibilities, that he expected Lily to cry out in pain the moment it formed. He immediately dropped it, smothering it with a practiced mental litany of soft, round feelings. The warmth of a sunbeam, the texture of worn denim, the taste of coffee. When he looked at Lily, she seemed calm, still absorbed in her book. He had managed to contain the explosion. But the thought, once created, couldn't be unmade. It sat in the back of his mind, a ticking bomb. How could he possibly plan an escape when the very act of planning was a beacon? He couldn't create a list. He couldn't consult a map. He couldn't calculate risks. He had to find a new way to think, a way to prepare for the future without acknowledging its existence. He decided to approach it through memory. There was a place he knew, a place from a life before Lily, before his wife. A memory from his own childhood, a small rustic cabin his grandfather had built deep in the Appalachian foothills. It was a 4-hour drive away, nestled in a valley so remote and quiet that even back then, in a world full of noise, it had felt like the edge of the earth. It was a place of deep woods and cold streams, miles from the nearest town. It was, he prayed, a place with less thought traffic. Communicating this to Lily was the first, most delicate hurdle. He couldn't just write, "We are going to the cabin." It was too direct, too sharp. Instead, he sat with her on the floor and began to tell her a story, writing it down on the notepad. "I am thinking of a memory," he wrote. "A soft memory. A house made of logs, tall trees that smell like pine needles, a green roof. Remember the smell of pine from the candle we had?" Lily nodded, a small smile on her face. "A soft memory. It was safe. In the memory we are packing a bag," he continued. "We are packing our softest clothes. We are packing the cans of soup that have the roundest letters on the label. We are putting them in the car." He was building the plan out of memories, framing every step as a recollection of a gentle, peaceful time. He wasn't planning an escape. He was simply remembering a pleasant holiday. It was a fragile, desperate trick of the mind, and it seemed to be working. Lily remained calm, treating it as one of their thought exercises. The physical act of packing was a nightmare of mental gymnastics. Each item was a potential landmine. When he went to the pantry, he didn't allow himself to think, "We need enough food for the journey and a week after." Instead, he entered a meditative state and simply moved cans from the shelf to the bag. His entire consciousness focused on the weight of each can, the feel of the cool metal in his hands. He was a machine, not a planner. Lily was his shadow, his silent, vigilant guide. She would stand in the doorway, her head tilted, monitoring the texture of his thoughts. He was packing a first aid kit, his mind briefly touching upon the possibility of a cut, a broken bone on the road, a sharp tug on his sleeve. He looked down. Lily's face was a mask of alarm. "The red box," she wrote, her letters frantic. "It's making you think of sharp things. Put it down. Think about the color of the sky." He dropped the kit, his blood running cold. He had almost shouted. He closed his eyes, gripping the smooth stone in his pocket, and flooded his mind with an image of a vast, empty blue sky until he felt Lily's hand on his arm relax. They left the first aid kit behind. It was better to risk a physical injury than a mental one. The greatest challenge was the route. The map was in the car's glove compartment, a folded paper minefield of sharp lines, complex intersections, and numbered highways. To look at it would be suicide. He had to rely on his 20-year-old memory of the drive. He sat with Lily, his eyes closed. He didn't try to recall the route number or the exact mileage. He tried to remember the feeling of the drive. "I'm remembering a big red barn on the left side of the road," he wrote. "I'm remembering the way the road curves after the barn. Soft curve. Then a crooked bridge," he continued, writing slowly, carefully. "The wood on the bridge feels bumpy." As he described the sensory details, Lily drew them on a fresh sheet of paper. Her drawing wasn't a map. It was a child's interpretation of a story. A big lopsided red square for the barn, a gentle curving line, a series of bumpy squiggles for the bridge. It was a map of feelings, not of places. A soft map. This, he prayed, would be enough. It took them 2 full days to pack. 2 days of intense, exhausting mental discipline. By the end, the car was loaded with a strange assortment of supplies chosen not for their utility, but for their mental inertness. The house, their sanctuary and their prison, was nearly empty. They stood at the front door, the car keys in David's hand. He looked at Lily and she gave him a single brave nod. It was time. He opened the door, and the heavy, profound silence of the outside world washed over them. They were leaving the relative safety of their quiet minds and stepping into a world saturated with the silent, screaming thoughts of millions of other terrified people. Every step to the car was a risk. Every passing house was a potential source of a psychic explosion. They were 2 tiny, quiet boats setting sail on an ocean of silent, screaming madness. Getting into the car was like stepping from a lifeboat into a shark tank. The familiar interior of their station wagon offered no comfort. Every window was a cinemascope view of a world littered with the casualties of the new war. David started the engine. The car vibrated to life, a purely physical sensation without its accompanying rumble, and the silence seemed to press in harder, offended by the mechanical intrusion. He pulled away from the curb, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. His entire being focused on one thing, projecting a state of absolute, unwavering calm. The suburbs were a graveyard of good intentions. Cars were everywhere, stopped at odd angles in the middle of the road, skewed onto lawns or crumpled against telephone poles. They were silent monuments to the exact moment a driver's mind had become too loud. More disturbing were the ones parked neatly in driveways, doors ajar, their owners lying motionless beside them. David drove with painstaking slowness, his eyes scanning not for traffic, but for the landmarks of his soft map. He ignored the street signs, the names and numbers, a language of sharp, dangerous logic he couldn't afford to read. He was looking for a feeling, a shape, a color. He was navigating the world as Lily did, through a collage of sensory impressions. They saw other survivors, but they were more like ghosts haunting the ruins of the old world. A man sat on a bus stop bench, staring at his hands with an unnerving placidity. As they passed, Lily touched David's arm. "He's quiet," her note read, "but his mind is empty, like a wiped clean slate." It was a horrifying thought. The man had survived, but at the cost of his self. Farther on, they saw a small group of people in a grocery store parking lot. They were arguing, their faces contorted in silent rage, their arms gesticulating wildly. They were planning, fighting, panicking. Lily recoiled as if struck. "Turn," she wrote, her letters sharp. "Turn now, they are a storm of noise. The listeners are circling them, I can feel it." David didn't hesitate. He swung the car into a hard right turn, bumping over a curb and driving through a manicured hedge, getting them off the main road and onto a quiet side street. He didn't need to look back to know what was happening in that parking lot. He had already seen it twice before. They found the big red barn from his memory an hour later. It was just as he'd remembered, a landmark of a simpler time, now looming over a dead, silent landscape. The sight of it, so solid and real, was the first genuine spark of hope he had allowed himself to feel. It meant the soft map was working. It meant this insane, impossible plan might not be a suicide mission after all. The hope was nearly his undoing. It was a sharp, bright feeling, and Lily immediately sensed it. "Careful, Daddy," she wrote, her small hand resting on his arm, a gentle anchor. Hope is a loud sound, too. He took a deep, steadying breath and flattened the feeling, pushing it down until it was just a soft, quiet warmth in his chest. They were on a 2-lane highway winding toward the mountains when they saw it. A roadblock, not a haphazard pile of abandoned cars, but an organized checkpoint. 2 military Humvees were parked in a chevron, and soldiers in fatigues were directing the few cars on the road. They had a large whiteboard set up, covered in what looked like logistical charts and maps. For a dizzying moment, David's heart surged with that same dangerous hope, order, authority. The old world reasserting itself. Here were people who were organized, who could protect them. Here was a chance for rescue. He slowed the car, his instinct to pull over and submit to their authority, almost overwhelming. Then a scream. A silent, desperate vibration tore through the car. Lily was rigid in her seat, her hands clamped over the sides of her head. Her body was trembling violently. Her face, when she turned to him, was a mask of pure terror and pain. Drive. The vibrations against the seat felt more than her actual scrawled note conveyed. "Go now, go." He looked from her agonized face to the soldiers, who were now waving at him with sharp, impatient gestures to pull over. He saw their maps, their radios, their focused, strategic expressions. He saw the intricate web of their plans. "They are making a banquet," Lily's note screamed from the notepad. "They are calling every listener for miles." Go, that was all he needed. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car surged forward, swerving onto the soft shoulder to bypass the Humvees. One of the soldiers looked up, his face a picture of surprise, then anger. He raised his rifle, his mouth opening in a silent, commanding shout. David didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. He drove for what felt like a mile before he dared to risk a glance in the rearview mirror. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The scene at the checkpoint was gone. In its place was chaos. The soldiers were no longer soldiers. They were just falling men. One was on his knees, head in his hands. Another was stumbling backward, a look of horrified surprise on his face. The man with the rifle had dropped it and was clawing at his own helmet. Their perfect, organized formation had crumbled into a silent, writhing heap of bodies. Their greatest weapon, their ability to think, to plan, to strategize, had been turned against them. David tore his eyes away from the mirror, his stomach churning. There was no rescue. There was no cavalry coming to save them. Any attempt to rebuild the old world, to fight back with logic and plans, was a death sentence. The only path to survival was not through strength, but through surrender. Surrender to the silence. He drove on, leaving the last vestiges of the old world dying on the road behind them, heading deeper into the mountains, deeper into the quiet. The final miles were a journey back in time. The cracked asphalt gave way to a gravel road, then to a dirt track barely wide enough for the car. Towering oaks and pines replaced the silent, dead houses, their dense canopies swallowing the sky. The silence here was different. It wasn't the tense, expectant quiet of the suburbs, thick with the ghosts of dead sounds. This was a deep, ancient silence, a quiet that felt primordial and profound. It was the sound of the world breathing. David followed the last of the soft map's landmarks, a uniquely twisted oak tree from his memory, and pulled the car to a stop in a small, overgrown clearing. There it was, the cabin. It was smaller than he remembered, built of dark, weathered logs with a gently sloping green roof that was now covered in a thick layer of moss and pine needles. It looked less like a building and more like a natural feature of the forest, something that had grown out of the earth. A wave of profound relief washed over David, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He hadn't even realized how taut his entire body was, a coiled spring of constant vigilance. Here in the heart of the deep woods, that tension finally began to unspool. They had made it. They had followed the impossible rules and navigated the minefield. And this was their reward, a sanctuary. He got out of the car, the air crisp and smelling of damp earth and pine. He helped Lily out, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a genuine, relaxed smile grace her face. "What does it smell like, Daddy?" She vibrated against his hand as they walked to the porch. "It smells like old trees and wet stones and cold, clean air," he mouthed, a real smile touching his own lips. The inside was a time capsule. A fine layer of dust covered the rustic wooden furniture. A stone fireplace stood cold and silent against the far wall. The air was thick with the comforting, nostalgic scent of wood smoke and old books. It felt safe. It felt like coming home to a place he'd only ever visited in his dreams. He let his mental guard down, allowing the soft, round memories of his childhood to fill his mind. For the first time, he didn't have to fight his own thoughts. He was so lost in his relief that he didn't notice at first that Lily had grown still. While he was exploring the dusty main room, she had stopped just inside the doorway. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her body was rigid, her head cocked at a sharp, unfamiliar angle. She was listening with an intensity that made David's newfound peace evaporate into a cold mist of dread. He rushed to her side, his notepad in hand. "What is it? Are they here?" She didn't respond immediately. Her brow was furrowed in deep, confused concentration, as if she were trying to decipher a language she'd never heard before. She finally took the pen, her hand unsteady. "They're here," she wrote, "but they are different." David's heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm, began its silent, frantic hammering again. "Different how? Are they weaker?" "No," she wrote, shaking her head. "Not weaker. Slower. Older." She paused, searching for the words. In the city, the whispers were fast, skittering like insects. Here, she looked around the cabin at the silent woods visible through the dusty windows. Here, they're not skittering. They're breathing. It's a deep sound, like a mountain taking a breath that lasts for 100 years. A chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's cold air snaked its way up David's spine. He didn't understand. Where are they coming from? He wrote, his hand shaking so badly the letters were almost illegible. Lily looked up, her sightless eyes seeming to stare directly into his, and her next words shattered the very foundation of his understanding of the world. "Not from a place, Daddy, from a thing. They're in the wood of the walls. They're in the stone of the fireplace. They're in the water running in the creek outside." She pressed her small hand flat against the rough wooden floorboards. "They're in the earth underneath us." She looked toward the door, towards the immense silent forest. "They've always been here. The whole time. The world wasn't quiet before. It was just loud. Our noise, the cars, the electricity, the talking, the thinking. It was all just a blanket. It kept us from hearing what was underneath. The great silence hadn't been an invasion. It had been a revelation. The listeners weren't monsters that had come to hunt them. They were the world itself. An ancient, slumbering consciousness that humanity, with its cacophony of civilization, had been unknowingly screaming at for centuries. The silence hadn't invited them in. It had just turned off the noise, and now, finally, they could hear humanity's terrified, frantic thoughts. David walked to the window, his legs feeling like lead. He looked out at the majestic, beautiful, silent forest. The towering pines, the moss-covered rocks, the gentle slope of the mountain. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was the thing itself. The breath of the wind in the trees, the trickle of water over stone. It was all the voice of the listeners. They hadn't escaped to a safe place. They had willingly walked into the heart of the beast. Despair was a physical presence in the cabin. It was in the way David now looked at the sturdy log walls, seeing not a shelter but a cage made from the enemy's bones. It was in the way Lily kept herself huddled in the center of the room, as far from the whispering earth and trees as possible. They hadn't escaped. They had merely arrived at a purer, more concentrated form of the horror. Hiding in one's own mind was no longer enough when the ground beneath your feet was listening. A new kind of desperation took root in David, a frantic energy born from the death of hope. He couldn't stay still. He began to tear the cabin apart, not in anger but in a desperate, animalistic search. He wasn't looking for food or a weapon. He was looking for a miracle, for something, anything that wasn't made of wood or stone. He needed an object without a voice, a piece of the old, noisy world. In the back of a musty closet tucked under a pile of moth-eaten blankets, he found it, a large, heavy, battery-powered shortwave radio. It was a relic from the 1970s, a block of faux wood paneling and brushed aluminum, its dials coated in a thick layer of dust. It was a machine designed to listen, and the irony was a bitter taste in David's mouth. He carried it to the table, his mind racing. The listeners were drawn to patterns, to meaning, to the signal within the noise of a thought. But what if he could create a sound that was pure noise, the absolute antithesis of a signal? A sound with no intent, no structure, no sharp edges. White noise, static. It was an insane, desperate hunch, but it was the only one he had. He found a pack of corroded D-cell batteries in a drawer. Miraculously, after scraping the contacts clean with his pocket knife, he found they still held a faint charge. He slotted them into the radio. He flicked the power switch. Nothing. The machine was as dead as the world outside. He refused to give up. The radio became his new focus, his new mantra. He found a small screwdriver and opened the back panel. The work was simple, mechanical, and blessedly thoughtless. He cleaned away decades of dust. He traced the old brittle wires. He reseated a loose connection to the main circuit board. The task consumed him, a perfect soft thought that kept the despair at bay. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was just thinking about the next wire. After an hour of meticulous, silent work, he tried again. He flicked the switch. This time, a small pilot light on the front of the unit flickered with a weak orange glow. The radio was alive. There was no sound from the speaker, but deep within the machine's electronic guts, a current was flowing. From across the room, Lily gasped. Not a sound, but a sharp intake of breath he felt through the floorboards. He looked up. She was staring at the radio, her head tilted, her expression utterly transformed. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. She scrambled over to him, grabbing the notepad. "What did you do?" she wrote, her letters alive with a sudden energy. "I turned on the radio," he wrote back, his own heart beginning a silent, hopeful rhythm. "It's fuzzy," she scribbled, her pen flying across the page. "Right here, around the box. The breathing sound of the woods. It's muffled, smudged. The listeners don't like it. They're pulling back from it." It was a shield, the meaningless electronic hum of the radio circuits. A sound that didn't even register to him. Was a form of camouflage. It was a pocket of the old, noisy world. A bubble of nonsense that repelled the ancient listening consciousness of the earth. Emboldened, David turned his attention to the speaker. A wire had come loose. He carefully stripped the end with his knife and reattached it to its terminal. He twisted the volume knob. A sound entered the cabin. It was faint, a barely there hiss like escaping air. In the profound silence they had grown accustomed to, it was as loud and shocking as a gunshot. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated static. A sound with no meaning, no pattern, no thought. Lily crept closer, her fear now completely replaced by an intense, overwhelming curiosity. She put her head near the speaker, as she once did to listen to seashells. She closed her eyes, her entire being focused on the gentle, meaningless hiss. David watched her, holding his breath. A long minute passed. When Lily opened her eyes and looked up at him, her face was filled with an emotion he hadn't seen since the world went silent. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was pure, unadulterated awe. She took the pen, but her hand was shaking too much to write clearly. She took a deep breath, calming herself, and then wrote 3 words that changed everything once again. "There's something else." David frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's just noise." She shook her head, a slow, wondrous motion. Her eyes were unfocused, looking past him, listening to a world hidden within the sound. "It's hiding inside the fuzz," she wrote, her letters now clear and certain. "It's not a whisper. It's a voice. It's very small. And it's singing." The cabin was no longer a prison, but an observatory. The small radio sat on the table, the center of their universe, emitting its gentle, constant hiss of static. For David, it was a shield, a bubble of meaningless noise that kept the ancient, breathing consciousness of the woods at bay. For Lily, it was a cathedral. She would spend hours near the speaker, her head tilted, a look of serene concentration on her face. She tried to describe what she heard, her notes full of a strange new poetry. "It's not words," she wrote. "It's a color, a thread of silver light singing inside a gray cloud. It's always been there, the static just clears the fog so I can hear it. The voice, the song, became their new focus. It was a soft thought, a safe thing to hold in their minds, but it was more than just a comforting presence. After 2 days of constant listening, Lily made a new discovery. "It's stronger over there," she wrote, pointing vaguely to the west. "The thread is brighter. It's pulling." The idea of leaving the relative safety of their static shield was terrifying, but the thought of staying, of waiting until the radio's old batteries finally died, was worse. This song was the only unexplained variable in a world governed by monstrously simple rules. It was the only hint of a power that wasn't the listeners. It was a thread of hope, and David knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that they had to follow it. They left the next morning, taking nothing but a few bottles of water and the precious radio, which David cradled in his arms like a newborn. They walked, following the almost imperceptible sense of direction from Lily. "A little more to the left, Daddy," she would vibrate against his arm. "The song is warmer this way." It was a slow, tense journey through the whispering woods. But with the radio's static hissing between them, the oppressive presence of the forest felt lessened, its breath less suffocating. They were a tiny island of noise moving through a silent, listening ocean. After nearly 2 hours of walking, they found it. A thin, almost invisible trail that led to a small house, even more remote than their cabin, tucked into a hollow by a creek. It was a simple, modern-looking home, with large windows that seemed to stare out into the woods with a calm, placid expression. They approached with caution, but the house felt different. It didn't feel dead like the homes in the suburbs. It felt quiet, purposefully quiet. The front door was slightly ajar. David pushed it open and stepped inside, Lily clutching his hand. The radio held out in front of them like a lantern in the dark. The interior was sparse and clean. In the center of the main room, a man and a woman sat on cushions on the floor, their backs straight, their hands resting on their knees. They were in a state of deep, focused meditation. They weren't catatonic. Their eyes opened as David and Lily entered, and they showed no fear, no surprise. The man simply raised a hand in a slow, gentle welcome. The woman smiled, a gesture of serene acknowledgement. They were survivors who had learned the same lessons of mental silence. Then David saw the boy. He was sitting at a large wooden table, perhaps a year or two older than Lily, with a shock of dark, curly hair. He was completely absorbed in his work, his small hands smudged with charcoal. The table, the floor, and the walls around him were covered in drawings. David's breath caught in his throat. He led Lily closer to the table, and the boy finally looked up. He had wide, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The woman rose silently and came to them, holding out a small whiteboard. "This is Elias," the note read. "He cannot hear you. He is deaf." David's gaze fell upon the drawings, and the world tilted on its axis. He was looking at a visual record of their nightmare. Dozens of the drawings depicted scenes of terrifying, abstract chaos. They were filled with swirling, menacing clouds of black and gray scribbles, formless and full of a furious, predatory energy. They were pictures of a sound. They were exactly what Lily had described. The listeners. But there were other drawings too. Pinned to the wall in a place of honor were images that showed a single, shining figure standing in the midst of the swirling darkness. The figure was humanoid, but it was made of pure, radiant light. In one drawing, its outstretched hands seemed to push back the encroaching scribbles. In another, it stood over a small house, a protective beacon in the night. It was the voice. Song. The silver thread. Elias had been seeing what Lily had been hearing. Elias looked from David to Lily, who was holding tightly to her father's arm, his eyes fixed on her. A flicker of understanding, of profound and electrifying recognition passed across his face. He slowly lifted a hand and pointed to a drawing of the shining figure. Then he pointed to Lily's ear. David, his voice a choked, silent whisper, described the boy's gesture to Lily. Her face, already pale, went white. The boy, Elias, then pointed to a drawing of the swirling, monstrous cloud. The listeners. He tapped his own eyes, a look of weary familiarity on his face. Understanding dawned. Lily let go of David's hand and took a hesitant step forward. She reached out her small hand, her fingers tracing the air where the drawing of the listeners hung. Then she pointed to her own ear. Elias broke into a wide, radiant smile. They were two halves of a single perception. One heard the darkness and the light. The other saw them. The woman wrote on the whiteboard again, her letters neat and calm. Elias has been drawing them since the silence. The Shining One taught us how to be quiet. It protects us. David looked at Lily, who was now standing beside Elias, her hand hovering just over his as he began a new drawing. They were not alone. They had found more than just other survivors. They had found allies. And with them, the first impossible, terrifying, and truly sharp-edged thought he'd had in a long time. The hope that this was a war they might actually be able to fight. The house by the creek became a war room. The two families, strangers bound by an impossible reality, shared their knowledge. David explained his hard-won discipline of soft thoughts, while Elias's parents, Ahab and Isabel, described the meditative emptiness they had cultivated, a practice guided by the visions of their son. The gentle hiss of the radio was the backing track to their silent collaboration, a shield that allowed them the dangerous luxury of communication. But the true alliance was between the children. Lily and Elias developed a language that transcended sound and sight. He would draw a shape, and David would describe it to Lily. She would listen to the world, and Isabel would write her descriptions for Elias to read. They were a bridge, connecting the world of the seen to the world of the heard. Through this bridge, they began to dissect their enemy. They are not one thing, Lily explained one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concentration. The breathing of the woods is a crowd, thousands of breaths, all different. Elias, upon reading this, nodded vigorously. He took a fresh piece of charcoal, and instead of drawing one enormous swirling cloud, he drew a dense cluster of smaller, individual scribbles, each one a distinct vortex of chaotic energy. They moved together, but they were separate entities. The enemy was not an army. It was a mob. This discovery was followed by another, even more profound. Guided by the song of the Shining One, Elias began to draw the listeners differently. Within his dark, frantic scribbles of a single listener, he would leave a small, deliberate void, a tiny circle of untouched white paper. "What is that?" David asked, describing the drawing to Lily. She listened, her head tilted toward the woods, focusing on a single breath among the many. Her eyes, though sightless, went wide. "It's a flaw," she wrote, her hand trembling with the gravity of her discovery. In its whisper, "There is a note that is wrong. It's sour. It's a part of the sound that fights itself. It's a weakness. Hope." It was the sharpest, loudest, most dangerous thought in the world, and it was now roaring silently between the four adults. Their enemy was not monolithic, and it was not invincible. But their hope, their frantic planning, their very collaboration was creating a psychic beacon. The static from the radio was a shield, but they were now shining a light so bright, it was beginning to strain the shield's integrity. "They can feel us," Lily wrote late one afternoon, her face pale. "We are allowed thought together. The breathing of the woods is getting faster. It's getting angry. They are coming." The dread was a familiar, cold blanket, but this time it was different. It was laced with a defiant resolve. They would not just hide. They would fight. As dusk settled, the psychic siege began. It wasn't a physical assault. There was no sound, no shaking ground. It was a pressure, a palpable weight on the mind, a focused wave of silent, malevolent intent that pressed in on the house. From the north, Lily vibrated, her hand on David's arm. "A big one. Its whisper is full of hunger. Show me," Isabel wrote on the whiteboard for Elias. Elias, his face a mask of concentration, began to draw. His hands flew across the paper, creating the form of the approaching listener, a dense, furious vortex of energy. And in its heart, he drew the small white circle of its dissonance. He held it up. "We see it," Ahab wrote. "Lily, can you hear the sour note?" Lily nodded, her small body tense. "Now," David wrote, looking between Ahab and Isabel. "No fear, no questions. Only calm, project it. Aim for the note." The three adults closed their eyes. David gripped the smooth stone in his pocket, but he did not use it to empty his mind. Instead, he filled his consciousness with the purest, most powerful state of calm he could muster. He imagined a perfectly still, deep blue ocean. Beside him, he could feel the serene, practiced emptiness of Ahab and Isabel's minds. They took their collective peace, their shared mental silence, and projected it outwards, a focused beam of tranquility aimed at the flaw the children had shown them. For David, it was the hardest thing he had ever done. The pressure from the listener was immense, a psychic scream that clawed at the edges of his concentration, tempting him with images of failure, of Lily's terror, of Marcus's silent death. He felt his focus waver, a spike of fear threatening to shatter his calm. A small hand found his, Lily's. She squeezed it, and through her he could feel the silver thread of the song, a pure, harmonious note that cut through the psychic din. He held on to it, anchoring himself to its beauty, and his resolve hardened into a diamond. He looked over at Elias. The boy was watching a scene none of them could see, his eyes wide. He suddenly picked up his charcoal and, on a new sheet of paper, drew the swirling vortex of the listener. But this time it was different. It was frayed at the edges, the lines less distinct. The white circle at its center seemed to be expanding, disrupting the chaotic pattern around it. It was working. They held their focus for what felt like an eternity. Then as one, Lily and Elias relaxed. The immense pressure on David's mind vanished, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. "It's gone," Lily wrote, her hand now steady. It turned away. "We heard it. They hadn't destroyed it. They had repelled it. They had taken their silence, the very tool of their survival, and forged it into a weapon." They huddled together in the center of the room, the 4 adults and the 2 children, bathed in the gentle, hissing static of the radio. They had survived the first battle, but they all knew with a chilling certainty that the mob now knew where they were. It knew they were not just quiet prey. They were something new, something dangerous, and it would be back. The sun rose the next morning on a world that was unchanged, yet entirely different. The woods outside were still an ocean of ancient listening consciousness. The silence was still absolute. But inside the small house, the despair had broken. The survivors of the psychic siege were exhausted, their minds aching from the strain of focused tranquility. But they were not broken. They were forged. David watched as Lily and Elias sat together at the table. Elias was teaching her a form of tactile sign language, pressing shapes into her palm. Lily, in turn, would guide Elias's drawing hand with the lightest touch, showing him the texture of the things she heard. They were building their own bridge, one that no longer needed the clumsy translation of adults. They were the first children of a new world, fluent in its silent, terrifying language. He looked out the window, his gaze sweeping over the silent, breathing forest. He no longer saw a monolithic, hateful enemy. He saw a complex and terrifying ecosystem. The listeners were the apex predators, yes, but the song and the static proved they were not the only inhabitants. The great silence had not been an apocalypse. It had been a scouring, a stripping away of humanity's noisy arrogance, forcing them to finally perceive the world as it truly was. There would be no return to normalcy. The old world was gone, a noisy dream that had faded. The future of humanity, if it was to have one, belonged not to the strong or the clever, but to the quiet, to the monks in their monasteries, to the thinkers who could find peace in emptiness, to the survivors like them who had been broken and remade by the silence. It was a harrowing, brutal form of evolution, and his daughter was at its vanguard. He looked at Lily. He had spent her entire life seeing her as a fragile thing, a blind child he needed to shield from the world. He saw now that he had been the one who was blind. She had always been able to perceive a deeper reality, a layer of existence he had been deaf to. She was not his ward to be protected. She was the prophet who had guided him through the gates of a new age. His love for her, once a sharp and fearful thing, had softened into a profound and quiet awe. Ahab and Isabel were preparing a simple, silent meal. A sense of domestic peace, of a future, was slowly returning. It would be a fragile existence, a life lived on a razor's edge of mental discipline, but it would be a life. They would learn. They would teach others if they could find any. They would be keepers of the new quiet, a silence that was not empty, but watchful, mindful, and strong. The radio hissed its gentle static, a constant, comforting presence. It was their fire, their hearth, the anchor of their new reality. Lily turned from her silent conversation with Elias and faced David. There was a smile on her face, a real and untroubled smile. It was a look of pure, unburdened peace. She had found her harmony in the heart of the terrifying new symphony. She picked up her notepad, the one that had been their lifeline through the darkest days, a catalog of their fears and discoveries. She wrote a single word and held it up for him to see. It was not a warning. It was not a rule. It was a promise. Hope. David looked at the word, then at his daughter, truly seeing her for the first time. She was a beacon. She and the boy who sees were the beginning of a new chorus. The world was a terrifying place, but for the first time since the sound had died, he knew, with a certainty that was as soft and as strong as a song, that they were no longer alone. And he listened.